So I'm going to focus on recovery, so the tail end of a flight, and that is be as prepared as you can for the kinds of terrain you're likely to encounter. So depending on the time of year around here, sometimes you're going to be, in 10-foot tall corn, literally, okay? And you can't see anything, and you can't even hear things very well. And so you need to be ready for that. And I remember being on a flight once and somebody said, I'm allergic to corn. And it's like, I wish I had known that because we're going to be in corn all day long. You better stay in the car type thing. Um, on the other hand, around here for sure, and most places in the country, you could encounter open water, you could encounter trees. And so in the case of trees, um, I don't like people to climb trees. I'm not saying it never happens, but I really don't like that. I also don't like to cut down trees, but that has happened too. My proposal for trees is that you have a expandable, extendable pole that allows you to reach up. This is my little one. This is only 30 feet long, okay? So it's telescoping. I've got a 60-foot version. We use them all the time. Man alive, they've paid for themselves many times over by being able to reach things that are not reachable from the ground and pull them down, which is rough on the things, but saves the tree and saves you from having to hire someone to climb the tree or cut down the tree or
So
whatever.
yeah, every
Um,
launch eventually lands somewhere, at least in our experience. And so there are numerous issues that can crop up no matter how well you plan and hope for a good trajectory and a good landing site. Um, you obviously have very little control over where the payloads ultimately land. And so we have landed in many, many very strange spots. This is flights in Maryland, but we have landed in, for example, a river once by accident. We fished it out, so that was okay. But more often it's things like you're landing in a field. For example, we landed in a pasture for racehorses, and at one point, because Maryland, I guess, has a lot of racehorses, and the owner was very reluctant, of course, to let us go out there, and we, of course, did not go out without talking to the property owner first. Um, but she was very worried about her horses getting upset by, first of all, our payloads landing in their field, but secondly, by anybody going out there. And so I guess one of the most important things about when you're recovering your payloads is to make sure that you find a property owner and you get permission to go on private property. That's essential. If it's public, it's a lot easier, obviously. But for private property, you really do want to be on good terms. And legally, you need to ask the property owner for permission before you can go collect your payloads. And so, other strange places we've landed, for example, was a chicken farm at one point. That was kind of weird. We've landed on top of a very big factory sort of thing, a very flat roof. And it was, of course, on a weekend. And so we had to find the security guard and get permission to get up on the roof to get our payloads. Um, Most often, though, almost always, you land in the top of the tallest tree. Even if there's a wide open field, the payloads are going to be at the top of the tallest tree. And so certainly having as much equipment as possible for getting payloads out of trees is a good idea. And we have a recovery bucket, as it's called, and related equipment that includes things like a very, very long pole, and then a professional arborist slingshot. The way you would use the slingshot is you would launch a little beanbag up and hopefully over your payloads, and then lower the beanbag down on the far side of the payloads, tie a stronger rope to that beanbag, and pull it back up and over. And so now you have a fairly strong rope that is looped over your payload string. And then you can, most, no, occasionally you can haul them down without too much difficulty. I'll be honest though, many, many times when we land at the top of a tree or 6 different trees, um, we ultimately have to call a tree climber. And so we have a tree climber on speed dial, and it has helped us out a lot. It's not necessary right from the get-go, but certainly if you can find someone good who's willing to climb trees and get payloads, that's priceless. And so any team that goes out to find payloads, first of all, they should not, they do not go alone. You always send at least 2 people, buddy system, or more often half a dozen people, and carrying equipment, for example, a long pole and stuff like that if they're going out into the woods, and also walkie-talkies so that they can be communicating with each other if they do decide to split up a little bit, and communicating back with the home base in case they need something else. And so walkie-talkies and water and all the basic recovery equipment would be an essential part of keeping everybody safe in a recovery operation. And then I'll add one more, which is sometimes a little scary, but we actually have a set of neon orange vests. And whenever it's any time like hunting season, well, first of all, we avoid that if possible, but I do get my students to wear, bright colored vests just in case, when they go into the woods to recover payloads.
I wanted to react to a few things that Mary just mentioned. We have an arborist slingshot. I've literally never used it. I've practiced with it a few times, but never had to try to use it. So I don't know how effective that is. We actually carry an inflatable boat, but I've never used that either, but I don't have to in the future. I don't have a tree climber on speed dial. I would call that a tree climbing arborist. I don't have one on speed dial, but I have actually looked up one and called one at one point. They happen to exist in many communities, and so I think the key is, I would say, call the one that's in the community you need as opposed to the one that's where you live, which may not be anywhere close to where you landed. A couple other comments. You have to use tracking that gives you a post-landing location, not just a location while it's in the air. That way you know where it's landed. You can look up on aerial photography what kind of terrain it's in. You can plan. It's like, yeah, you need to go to the north and approach it from the north because it's closer to the road on the south, but you have to go over a river or a ravine or something to get to it from the south. That also allows you to decide what to carry. It's like, yep, it's in trees. We might need a ladder. We might need a pole. Let's just carry it starting from the beginning, even before we know exactly where it's landed. Bring the equipment we think we need. She mentioned walkie-talkies. We have walkie-talkies and very rarely use them here in Minnesota because we have pretty good cell phone service everywhere. But if your tracking depends on cell phone service, that's an important point because if you need cell phone service and hence internet that comes with it to know where to go, then you can't find a payload if it lands someplace that has no cell phone service, unless you have a plan. And the plan probably is something like, wait till it lands before we even try to approach it. Wait till we know exactly where to go, because once we go down that road, we're not going to have cell phone service. If you get maps up on your phone, sometimes you can access the maps even when you don't have cell phone service, as long as you don't expect your phone to refresh the maps. Or if you aren't sure whether it's going to land in a place with cell phone service or not, and you find out that it's no cell phone service, you need a rendezvous spot. It's like, okay, if you go there and you don't have cell phone service, go back to the last town, find a gas station. We'll meet in this park or something like that. And then we'll plan from there how to proceed. During an eclipse, my recommendation is that you don't chase while the thing is still in flight, because everybody's going to be looking at the sky and not paying attention to how they're driving, which can be dangerous. Usually we are tracking while things are in flight, and sometimes even arrive and see them land. We arrive before the thing actually lands. I know in Montana, for instance, they almost always let the thing land before they even start chasing it, so they know exactly where to go, because they kind of assume it will land someplace that has no cell phone service. So that's a different approach. You need to figure out what makes the most sense for every given flight. And in the case of an eclipse flight, I would probably let it land before I went looking for it. That's my plan. But one final thing about landowner permissions. I completely agree. You should get landowner permission. On the other hand, it's often impractical to do so. So I would change that to be, you should try to get landowner permission. or at least permission from somebody. Here in Minnesota, often the landowners are not the people who live on the land. And therefore, if I find a person, they often say, oh, that's not my property, that's Bob's. It's like, okay, can I talk to Bob? Oh, he's in Arizona. It's like, okay, that's not great. Would Bob mind? Oh, he wouldn't mind. That's good enough for me. I would call that partial permission. But more likely than either of those scenarios is we can't find anybody to talk to. Now, ballooning groups differ on what to do next. Okay, I'm of the camp that if you can't find anybody to talk to, you should just go about your business, but perhaps leave somebody behind to intercept anybody who would show up. It's like, that was a driveway, there's nobody at the house, I'm going to leave somebody in the driveway. If somebody comes home, they can't miss my person who will then tell them what's up, and that person could get a hold of me by phone, or maybe I'm the person, get a hold of the team, by phone or by walkie-talkie, so that the landowner, if they were to show up, at least knows what you're doing. In fact, it's important that you have this post-landing location because the landowner wants to see. It's like, yeah, I've got something. It's in that field right behind your house. Let me show you on a map. Let me show you on my phone. And they might say, oh, that's okay. They're usually quite interested. But watch out for the electric fence. But I will help you. I will turn off the electricity or something like that. So they can be helpful. They can offer advice. Sometimes you don't know that you're about to hit the electric fence, but they can give you a heads up about that. And if they want to help you, by all means, accept that. Don't keep them away. But usually I tell people, here's what I'm doing, here's where I'm going, and they usually say, go do it, fine. And they're not worried about what I'm doing, but they don't necessarily offer to accompany me or offer to help me. And then always, you just need to be efficient. You don't want to stay out in the field any longer than necessary, whether it's private property or not private property. So have the stuff you need, get your job done. And in particular, if you're on private property without permission, which might happen, I think, get off the property as soon as you can. So you might say, after we recover the payloads, we like to open them up and look them over carefully. I would at least take the payloads back to public property before I did any of that. Get off the property as promptly as you can. One final comment about landowners or people in general, it's important you don't alarm them. So I would suggest don't go chasing and tracking and recovering after dark. Don't have 20 people show up at somebody's doorstep, maybe just one or two, but certainly tell them, here's what we're doing, here's where we're from. And in my case, I'm a professor and I have students with me. You don't have to say I have 20 students or 3 students, but maybe don't have the actual 20 students in view, or certainly not in their face when you first arrive. And again, in my experience, this may depend on where you are in the country, but in my experience, people are more interested, especially if you're very upfront about what you're doing and try not to be pushy. But you have stuff, it's valuable, you need it back. And so I don't usually take no for an answer, but rather try to come to some negotiated agreement, which might involve sending them a picture from the flight. It's like, sorry to disturb you. I really need that stuff back. My students are counting on it. They'll be very disappointed if we can't get it back. In the case of an eclipse, presumably the people know that happened. And so they might be quite interested in what you have. And you could say, would you like to see a photograph of our eclipse footage? I need to get the stuff back to get the photograph, which is more or less true. The best photographs will probably be taken from the payloads and not necessarily the highest quality sent down to the ground. So encourage them in any way necessary, and encourage them to help you out if they possibly can. You'll have to play it by ear, and certainly don't upset them, don't alarm them, but work with them as best you can to make sure that you can recover your payloads.